Jess, I was actually considering having a very short stand-up routine for this part of the session, but after much thought, I decided against it.
I've heard you're very funny though, so you have the floor.
People have occasionally told me that, but it sometimes felt a little forced, so I think I was going to hold off.
Yeah, no one thinks that I'm funny, so
No.
didn't even try.
Oh. Well, we're all about providing information today, so that probably won't stand against you.
I was worried.
One day we'll do a comedy webinar. That'll be a fun one.
But it'll have to be like UX jokes. That's
UX jokes. 1 hour of UX jokes. We'll have to dig deep for that, I think. All right, so I may get started relatively quickly, just because we've got lots of content to get through today. So my name is Eric. I'm head of partnerships at Academy XI. I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a second. Just before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are virtually gathered today and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today's session is called Big Data versus Deep Insights, an hour with a qualitative user researcher. A bit of a mouthful, but I think it gets across what it needs to get across. So before I introduce our special guest for the day, who I'll be having a chat with, the one who knows the stuff, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Academy XI, what we do, what this webinar series that we run is all about. So for those who aren't familiar, we are a school. Despite my accent, which is Canadian, we're based out of Australia. We've got 2 campuses, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne. And we've got a whole suite of online courses that we run as well, exclusively at the moment due to COVID, as you can imagine. So we deal in emerging disciplines is the phrase that we use. What that really means is design and digital disciplines. So any role that's like job role where there's going to be more people doing that job next year than this year, more people the year after that, that's kind of where we focus. And yeah, so we do sort of the core of our work is around human-centered design. So we teach user experience design, service design, CX. Research is a big part of all of those, as we'll discuss today. And then on the other side of things, we teach product management, data analytics, digital marketing, agile. So sort of that whole space is where we operate. I'm the head of our corporate training division. So we train either broad human-centered design topics, or we do a lot of upskilling for UX teams, for example, service design teams in specific areas within the design world. And sometimes areas just outside of their space, like at the crossover to digital for a design team, or design for a digital team, vice versa, that sort of thing. So I do that, and then we also have our B2C courses, for lack of a better word, which are courses for individuals for all those same subjects. So today's topic, user research, is quite close to our hearts because, as I mentioned, yeah, the design space research sits at sort of the foundational level of all the things we teach. For example, our flagship 10-week training programs, the first 2-3 weeks are exclusively research. How to conduct interviews, contextual inquiries, which we'll discuss later, all that kind of thing. So it really is key to what we do. And as any designers out there will know, key to what you guys do as well. However, for a lot of people, I think even in the design world and out of it, research is kind of this thing that happens inside a black box, sort of hidden away from everyone else. To a certain extent, that's for a reason. Research kind of needs to be compartmentalized in many cases, which we'll discuss. But for that reason, again, people just don't really know as much about it. It's something that almost anyone in any role anywhere in the world can either use in their role or will benefit from knowing about, even if it's just when they receive the outputs of research. Like, how do you look into this and see, what's gone into that research? So, so we thought it'd be really interesting to have a session solely devoted to user research, and that's what you are now a part of. So a few housekeeping items before I introduce our guest today. So down in the bottom, you'll see that there's a chat. There's also a Q&A. So any thing that you feel like shouting out can go into the chat. If you have any questions for myself or for Jess, who I'm about to introduce, those can go into the Q&A. We're going to have about a 35-minute conversation on the topic that's about to start. And then after that will be about 15 minutes of questions to either one of us. Then at the end, anything we haven't gotten to, we'll be sending out sort of a follow-up email tomorrow, and we can try and answer your questions there. So feel free to fire the questions into the Q&A starting now and throughout the session right towards the end. And that is about enough of me rambling on. So I'm now going to introduce Jess Nichols, who is lead user researcher at Dovetail, formerly of Twitter and Uber in San Francisco. Very small companies, but they are very reputable. So I think she probably knows what she's talking about. So hello, Jess.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name's Jess Nichols. As Eric mentioned, I'm currently the user research lead at Dovetail, which is a product for researchers, which really allows them to sort of analyze and store all of the research that they capture during qualitative research. I've been in qualitative research for about 10 years. I started my career at Deloitte in consulting and then transitioned over to the product side, working at Uber and Twitter. And I'm really excited to be here.
Great, thanks, Jess. So I think we'll jump into the questions that I have for you. So this will really be a whole session around questions and answers, both from me and from others. So I think probably a good starting point is just to define for anyone who's kind of new to this space, like the two types of research, so qualitative and quantitative. Could you just describe the differences there and then sort of tell a little bit about what your focus is in the research space?
Yeah, absolutely. So qualitative research is much more focused on context and observations. So really what you're trying to find there is a lot of really unstructured data to understand people's attitudes around something. So sort of what they're saying around their experiences and things like that. Whereas quantitative data is much more focused on the behavioral insight that you capture through more structured data, through analytics and surveys and things like that. Generally, when you're looking at qualitative data, it's much more on the depth of understanding. So really understanding that really true, rich insight with the people that you're talking to and understanding that experience. Whereas with quantitative research, it's much more of the breadth. So really trying to be able to generalize those understandings to sort of be in that broader audience.
Nice, yeah. And so like from my perspective, we mostly focus on qualitative. I think everyone knows what pie charts are and spreadsheets, and everyone's got their Excel to refer to. And that is an important piece, but I think the qualitative data is sometimes what gets lost in the mix. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to be able to speak to somebody else that focuses on that space, because that's what we do as well. So when it comes to sort of the qualitative and the quantitative data, like, do you combine them? Is that what you do? Is it usually a combination? Like, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think qualitative is really great. It's kind of what my background is, to really explaining the why something is happening, which isn't something that you necessarily are able to capture from quantitative data. So you'll get a lot of the what from quantitative data. So looking at analytics and sort of that instrumentation within platforms, you can see the process that people are taking, but you don't necessarily know why they're taking that process. What this then sort of ends up risking is that a lot of people will look at quantitative data and make their own assumptions about the why. And so this can be very risky in the sense that you can be making the false assumptions, especially if you have a lot of domain knowledge around a certain area. So being able to actually combine the quantitative data that you're capturing with the why and the story around what you're actually seeing is kind of a research superpower, because it can really help confirm those hypotheses and really ensure that you're able to focus in the right direction when improving your product experience.
Right, yeah, so I think that, yeah, when you're sort of working with a data set that is quantitative, and correct me if I'm wrong, like, yeah, you've got lots of sort of base insights, but if you think that you really understand the individuals that are drilled down into that quantitative piece, I think you're probably missing a bit of a card there. So that's where qualitative data comes in, is that?
Yeah, so like, for example, like if you're looking at your analytics and you see that there's a massive drop-off point like halfway through your conversion funnel, so people are just like not actually buying a product, for example, you could assume that there's like something wrong and you can make a guess and try to improve it just with that quantitative data. Whereas if you actually talk to people about their experience, you may find that the actual reasoning is very, very different. It might be that they don't understand the description, the colors are off. And it's really that qualitative data that really provides that richer insight, just to help you directionally validate what you're actually seeing with the quantitative data.
Yeah, because I think I mentioned that at the beginning as well. As if you're a product manager or a product designer, if you're a UX designer, it just, by human nature, it's really hard to step away from your own knowledge of a topic or a product. Also hard to avoid biases as well, I guess. So a researcher has, I think, I don't know if in my experience, it's safe to say that researchers and designers sometimes have a bit of a love-hate relationship, I guess. Like they understand the value, but it is so hard to go in with something that you spent so long working on. During like usability testing, for example, and be like, oh no, people hate it. So do you think it is important to separate that out, or?
So for me, like I always believe that researchers are there to be much more of that neutral party and kind of capture all the different insights that from all the different information sources that are out there within an organization. I think anyone that understands users is amazing and needs to keep doing that, but there's definitely certain nuances and techniques in how you do it. And so I think the first point is really being self-aware around those biases. So like, for example, with designers, if they've designed an experience and then are actually user testing that same experience, it's going to try to like solutionize it for them in their own way. And so they may assume that pain points that users have aren't necessarily the actual pain points because it didn't fit within the mental model when they built their first design. Yeah. Whereas with product managers, what I've sort of seen is they'll go and talk to one customer that may be a really high value customer and be like, we have to make every single product decision because we've spoken to this one person. Whereas what you're really trying to find are those pain points that really fit that entire customer experience and customer base that you may have. And so just having that awareness of, hey, I'm actually only talking to someone, or I only have that domain knowledge is like really, really key. But if designers and product managers are really interested in learning more about research, there are so many resources out there to actually sort of help train you up, learn how to ask the right questions, learn how to sort of not focus on those biases to make sure that when you are having those conversations in qualitative research, that you are getting the best insight out there.
Yeah, and kind of remove yourself from the process to a certain extent. Yeah. I find even like in my role where I'm sort of designing training programs for clients, I find it really hard not to go straight into solution mode. I'm instantly like, I'm trying to solve problems, which is what designers do, but you kind of have to take that step back, which is where the research comes in. And I guess on that note, to some extent, what would you say is the best time to conduct qualitative research, like during a product or a project life cycle? Is it like right at the beginning, or are there certain phases where you should sort of do this?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think there's always opportunities to conduct research throughout the entire life cycle. Like research does not have to be this very intense, very laborious sort of the process. Like there's ways to do quick light touch research that still gives you that directional validation so you can really understand your users throughout the entire life cycle. In saying that, there's kind of maybe two main areas that I would generally try to focus on. The first one is really around that problem definition. So before you actually start to build out that experience. So being able to understand where the knowledge gaps are within an experience, being able to sort of find those customer pain points can really make sure that when you're making decisions around product prioritization, you're really making them in a way that really resonates with the customer base that you're focusing on. The other area is right before engineering. So generally what we try to do is more evaluative research in this area. So this might be things like usability testing or information architecture testing. And this just really makes sure that before that heavy investment of engineering does start, you are making sure that the experience is really meeting those customer needs. Forbes has a really great stat around this where it's like $1 invested in UX actually has a return on investment of $100. Just because of that investment, you don't have to then spend the time and effort doing the change management after you've built something to make sure it's still aligning to those users' needs.
Yeah. So would you say it's sort of like before you design a thing and then before you make the thing? Is that kind of an easy way to break it down? And I used to work in like the software development space, like in agency land. And I mean, yeah, people would come to us that hadn't really done any sort of research around their customers. They were like, this is the thing that we need to build and we need to build it straight away and go. And we were like, I mean, we'll take your money, but if at the end of the process, if it doesn't turn out to be the thing that you needed, you're going to be back to square one. And like the amount of completely wasted software dev dollars that we saw, or people would come to us with broken products as well. They were like, oh, we built this with no UX. or no research, and it sucks. Basically, no one wants to use it. So this is, and so when we're talking to when I'm talking to on the project delivery side of things, to exec teams, etc. You're like, do you want to be the guy that delivered or a girl that delivered a faulty product, or do you want to be the person that spent a bit of extra time on research at the beginning and built the thing that needed to get built? So yeah, I think it's super important.
But yeah, that's why all of those softer skills for researchers are so important. I think a lot of people assume that if you're a researcher, then the bulk of your effort is actually focused on just doing the right methodologies and actually executing the research. What I found through my career is actually more of the softer skills. So communication, presenting and influencing are actually way more important, because there's no point doing a research project if you're not going to get the buy-in from your stakeholders, and making sure that they really understand the value is absolutely key. And so, I've definitely been in positions in my career where I've had product managers come to me and be like, this is the right solution. And you actually have to spend that time influencing them, helping them understand that, hey, you may have some biases here. Hey, there may actually be other things we might need to consider to make sure they're really building the right product for our users.
Yeah. No, that's really, really I think a good takeaway from anyone to have is, do you want to be the person that has data and research to back up your statements in your direction? Or do you want to be that gut feeling person that can, it's great as long as it works, but all it takes is one fail, and it doesn't go so well for your career. So not to be super scary and oh no, but it's so important. So I guess there are probably, on that note, certain product manager, not to single out product managers, but certain people out in these spaces that think that an interview, for example, a user research interview, is just a conversation that anyone can do it. What would you sort of say to that? What are some tips and tricks, the process behind that interview process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people do assume that just having an interview is literally just having a conversation, but there are so many nuances that researchers will use to make sure that they're actually getting the right insights out of those conversations. So the first one that I generally use is actually spending the first half of any sort of interview that I have just building rapport. And the reason that I do that is because building rapport helps you build trust with your participant, and someone that has trust in you is more likely to give you richer insights, be much more truthful and authentic in those conversations. So generally, I'll have sort of a lot of, getting to know you questions, sort of very fact-based questions for that first half. So by the time I've kind of warmed the participant up, we can get into those more pain pointy or opinion-based questions, and they're more likely to share their actual feedback. The other one is just the actual way that I approach questioning. So you should always go from more of an open-ended question to a closed question, because generally closed questioning can be very biasing. It can be very leading. And so by having that open question at the start, it gives you the opportunity to kind of explore that response with the participant. So generally the framework that I generally use is that my first question will be kind of more of a discovery question. So very, very open-ended. The next one will be more validating that answer. And then the final one will be more paraphrasing, just to make sure that we have that shared understanding. So for example, I might ask somebody what they had for breakfast this morning. They may respond that they had Vegemite toast, because obviously Vegemite is the best. I would
that's pretty leading right there, though, I must say.
Well, this isn't a research, so it's okay.
I think I might have probably made an enemy of some Australians just then. Carry on.
I'm okay with that. I'm team Vegemite all the way. They would say that they had Vegemite toast on their thing. I would ask if they had anything else. They may say they had yogurt. And then at the end, I would paraphrase. I'd be like, just to confirm, you have Vegemite toast and yogurt for breakfast. And that sort of process just makes sure that you really are getting that right answer from the participant and not necessarily being biased or leading in your own way.
Right. Okay, cool. And this is a big one that I hear a lot of people ask at the beginning when they're taking our courses, is how many people do they need to go out and research or do the research with, do interviews with? Because it is really time consuming and it can be quite expensive to find individuals to do deep dive one-on-one research or interviews with. So yeah, how many, what's the right number? Is there one?
This is the $1 million question. And I will say that it depends on the methodology and the types of users that you're looking for. There have been so many times where I've had a PM come up to me. Again, I don't want to judge PMs, but they'll come up to me, they'll be like, hey, we spoke to this one person and we're going to change the entire product based on these insights. And it's really hard because when you're trying to find insights, you really need to make sure that you're finding patterns. So multiple users that are having that same pain point versus just one individual. So Nielsen Norman has this thing where it's like you can talk to 5 users to get 80% plus of the usability insights. This is technically correct, but I would also add on that you want to be looking at the different types of users. So for example, if you have 2 different key user groups, you want to look at least 5 for each of those user groups, just to make sure that you are starting to see those patterns in each of those audiences. For me, generally what I'll try to do is 8 to 10 participants if I'm doing user interviews on a single customer base, just because there may actually be nuances in there that I may not necessarily know about from the get-go. So I want to make sure that I have that flexibility to make sure if I do discover those down the track, then I can be more targeted in who I sort of engage with in later on in those interviews.
Okay, so does that mean, so if you kind of hear something from like maybe the first or second participant that you're like, I don't even really know what that person means, or what I need more clarity on that, then you would hope to see repetitions of that same commentary like later on, or you'd go out and try to find that again, or?
A little bit of both. So I would see if that pattern came up in any of my other participants, but if I didn't feel that I had enough of that sort of segment, I would go out and reach out to more people.
Right. And sometimes when you're doing interviews, do you just get information back that's completely out of left field and just causes you to totally move sideways and go in a different direction, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think the whole point is that you're doing research because you don't know things, right? Like you're not going out to do research just to check the box. And so you have to be really open to that discovery during the research approach, and making sure that you give yourself enough of that flexibility to go and like look at those other audiences that you're discovering if you really feel that there is something there. But at the end of the day, you know, what I would really focus on is just making sure that you set your expectations with stakeholders on who you did and did not engage with research. So if you don't have the time to go out and explore all those like rabbit holes of like other participant groups that are sort of out there, just being able to go back and be like, hey, we only spoke to 10 different types of this user. If we do future research, you know, these are the opportunities that we could start looking at, that it will let us explore these other areas.
Right. So just being sort of honest and open about the extent of who's been spoken to, and not trying to have, if you've just spoken to one specific user group, trying to like apply the insights gained to the entire sort of market segment, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you don't want to be misleading. You don't want to set the expectations with your stakeholders that this like 8 people that you spoke to is the answer to everything within your product. And so I think just being really clear up front is key.
Yeah, I think there is kind of, I think something that you mentioned as well is good to point out, is that sometimes, to be honest, people are just ticking boxes when they're doing research. Like exec level, they're like, oh, we have to do this, but they think they know what's best, or somebody does. And so being able to sort of mitigate that situation and using almost maybe clarity of who you actually interviewed to be like, this isn't, or maybe they'll latch on to data that does sort of support what they want to do. And we're like, okay, good, but it doesn't mean that you're 100% validated across the board to pursue. So I think that clarity of what you've actually done is a super good takeaway for anyone listening. So here's a bit of a tricky question maybe. So how do you make sense of unstructured data? So you get in all this stuff coming from different people, and because it's deep dive, like interview data, it's kind of coming at you in these little nuggets of wisdom and here and there. Like, how do you take all of that qualitative data and turn it into something structured, or something that can be shown and you can pull insights out of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do a quick shout out to Dovetail. Obviously Dovetail, this is what Dovetail does on a daily basis. But I actually did some research recently, and I found that people actually fell into 2 main buckets of how they do their analysis. There's team spreadsheet and team post-it. And so team spreadsheets really focused on having that structured information architecture and trying to find insights that fit within that existing mental model. Whereas team post-its really focused on that organic analysis and affinity of data to really find where those insights are. Either approach is fine. I think there's one, you've got to consider the trade-off. So obviously having that predefined information architecture really constrains you from being able to discover those novel insights that you may not have necessarily been looking for in your research. Whereas on a more organic approach means it's probably going to be a lot more time. And if you're trying to be efficient with your research, it can drag out if you have a lot of post-its and insights to go through. But really what it's about finding are those trends and themes, either across the journey, either across organically, that really sort of help you understand what those users' explicit and implicit needs are. That may be through pain points and things like that as well. But just being able to sort of build that structure and then find what those themes are can then sort of help you move that into more of a narrative approach. So another one of those softer skills that's incredibly important is storytelling. Just because you need to be able to have that stickiness with the insights that you're sharing to really resonate with your stakeholders. So yeah, I guess structure or unstructured initially, but then sort of moving into that story is what I find is key.
Yeah, I like the storytelling piece, because that's obviously a big part of human-centered design as a whole. We've actually just built a course called Data-Driven Storytelling, which is all about that, like take an insight, wrap a story around it, create a call to action, and then tell the person you need to tell about it. And here's what we recommend that you do based off of that. It's such a good little skill for anyone to have. Coming back to the post-it versus spreadsheet kind of divide, or just different ways of approaching things, would you say that there's a different, there's scenarios where one would work better than the other? Like my thinking is, and I don't know if this is true, is that maybe post-it would be better for like maybe an early stage startup that was still kind of exploring what their product was going to be, and maybe spreadsheet is a bit more of a mature company. Is that, I could be totally out to lunch on that though.
Yeah, I don't think it's that approach. I think it's probably more if you're doing like foundational generative work, you're probably better off doing something that's a lot more organic through like post-its or affinity analyses, just because you can then find those insights without having those inherent biases. Generally, evaluative research is going to be much more effective for a spreadsheet because you're looking at, you know, what is the task? What did this participant do? But what I was sort of hearing during this research is, regardless of the approach, so whether it was more foundational or generative research or evaluative, people either really stuck to spreadsheets or they're really stuck to post-it notes. For me, I'm team spreadsheet. I'm always someone that likes to have that structure, but what I'll try to do is have that flexibility. So if I do find organic novel insights during my research, that there's still a space for that, rather than kind of having a very defined structure that doesn't let me sort of have that discovery in the work that I'm doing.
Okay, thank you. So next question. So how do I leverage the outputs of qualitative research in my project? Like, what do I do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on the type of research that you're conducting. So if it's much more of that foundational or generative research, I think everyone's done research reports or presentations in the past, but it's really important to find ways to really visualize those insights, again, to really resonate with your stakeholders so they get that buy-in, they really understand the findings, and it's something that can be easily digested by them when they look at it. So things like personas or journey maps can be incredibly useful to really visualize those experiences and the users that you're focusing on for research. I've also heard of people building out posters and one pages that they stuck around their office. Obviously with COVID, can't necessarily do that right now, but really having other ways to sort of visualize and share those bite-sized nuggets. So it might be that you post an insight or two on Slack, for example. With more evaluative research, I think you actually want to be a bit more tactical and grounded in the designs that you're working with. So if you are doing usability testing, you want to make sure that the recommendations that you're coming back with are incredibly actionable for a designer or an engineer to go and make that change as quickly as possible.
So that kind of all fall under the sort of purview of data synthesis? Is that the moment when you're sort of, you've now got your raw data and you're now turning it into insights? Is that?
So I would say that the journey is more, you have your data, you build out the themes to the insights, but then it's kind of like, how do you actually want to share that out? Because I think, you know, not many people are going to want to go and look through like a very long list of insights, especially stakeholders. For them, they're kind of looking for what that researcher point of view is. What are the next steps or action items that I need to take as a product manager, as a designer, as an executive? And so figuring out ways to translate the depth of data that you have into something that really is going to resonate is absolutely key to make sure that research is engaging.
Okay. Is that to some extent the format that you present that information in, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
And broadly, so do you have like most of the time, or is there sort of a divide where you have stakeholders that are just like, I just want, like, they want your opinion, or is it usually like, I just want to see the data? I mean, with qualitative, it kind of needs to be your opinion a little bit, but how, like, do you have people that sit on the different side of that fence in terms of how much of your opinion they want coming into what you're telling them?
Yeah, so I've seen kind of over time that people have been sort of more, I just want to see the data, to I want an opinion and an action item. For me, if you want to really be embedded in sort of more of that like product model with like engineering, product and design, you need to become that trusted advisor as the research, that person that can kind of capture all of the disparate knowledge that's like floating around within an organization, because there's definitely more than just research doing research, right? And so being able to do that, take that, and then actually come back to a product manager with a point of view, I think is incredibly important for any researcher out there today. Because you want to be able to sort of have that point of view and be able to influence the product into more of a customer-centric way. So I would always encourage researchers to make sure that your end game is having that point of view and those action items that you can then share back with the stakeholders. So rather than them being overwhelmed by a bunch of information that they're most likely not going to read, they only need to read 3 things that's going to give them the essence of what they actually need to take away from that research.
Okay, cool. Because I often refer to UXers as sort of like the champion of the user, but I guess researchers would fall directly into that category as well. Okay, here's one that I actually was quite interested to hear from you on. How do you get internal buy-in to conduct qualitative research? Because I know you don't always have an easy time of it.
Yeah, like I would say, you know, don't bribe people. That would be my first recommendation. That was my joke for the day. But
sorry, I meant to laugh. You know, I
yeah.
lost the moment a little bit. It was very good.
Getting buy-in is absolutely a marathon. It is not a sprint. You are not going to be able to convince someone to have buy-in to research after like 1 second or one thing that you're doing. And so for me, I've always focused on asking for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. So if you think that research is going to add value to your organization, you should definitely be going out and doing it. When it comes to actually getting that buy-in, my recommendation would be, as a first step, is to do something small that's going to have a lot of value. Generally, I find that things like usability testing or surveys, which have a very low level of effort, as well as very quick to turn around, can be really, really useful to get a couple of those really key insights that you can start sharing with others, so your stakeholders, and sort of start to show that value of the research. Once you get that initial buy-in, it's really important to take stakeholders along that journey. So all the way from planning research, figuring out the questions and making sure that they have input into those questions, to getting them to attend research sessions, in some cases maybe even writing notes in those sessions, to actually reviewing findings before they're shared out more broadly. It gives stakeholders this level of investment and accountability to what those final outputs are, but it also makes sure that there's no surprises in those findings as well. So they've actually seen everything, they've seen the process, they have an understanding of how long or how short something's going to take, and understand what the output is and why that output is as it is. Once you have all of that though, it's really important for you to positively incentivize that engagement. So if someone comes to you with like one question that they want to ask, or they join one session, you should think of them as the most amazing person in the entire universe, because if they positively associate with research, they're more likely to want to keep on engaging with you through all of these different research activities. The last thing I would recommend is also just to be your own biggest cheerleader. Use every single internal communication tool that you have, whether it's Slack, email, face-to-face, video chat, to share your insights. It might be sharing maybe 1 or 2 insights. It might be something that's relevant to an individual, but just making sure that you keep sharing those insights so people keep seeing the value of research. And so rather than it being kind of a huge, you know, big flash in the pan, it's that slow burn marathon that will then kind of inception them to loving research.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, for me, the same. Like, I get a lot of potential clients coming to me about team training for human-centered design, et cetera. And they often will come with the big, huge plan and like this incredible thing that they want to do. They want to transform the whole company through upskilling, and it's amazing and it's great. And it's usually a fantastic idea, but I just kind of have to ground them in like, is this achievable straight off the bat? I mean, and literally training people to do research is one of the things that people come with. And I usually say, like, let's do something bookended, like a discrete piece of training that they can actually bring real, in the case of research, like let's actually do some research in the training, and you can go away and show people the insight that you've pulled. And instead of just, oh yeah, we did some training on something and then nobody remembers it, you have an output from that training. And then, yeah, the other thing that I really liked what you said was turning people into champions, basically. If you tell someone this research is super important, you need to listen to it in all of your, you know, like work that you do, especially if they're like exec level, they're going to be like, yeah, okay. But if you get them involved and they're sort of finding out the insights along with you, suddenly they're like, oh, this is like my secret weapon as well. and suddenly they're championing you and the research and the insights that you've pulled, which is the whole like sort of stakeholder buy-in across the board is probably one of the most difficult and best broad skills anyone can really have, I think, in the corporate space or government as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think like the getting them to attend the sessions, getting them to write notes is kind of like the secret sauce, because if they're attending a session and you tell them, hey, you need to write notes, they actually have to listen to the research versus just being in there observing, and maybe they might zone out halfway through.
They're on their phone,
it doesn't matter if you're
stuff,
exactly right. So even if the insights that they capture don't make any sense, are not relevant to what you're doing, the fact that they've actually listened to that interview then gives them something to sort of stick with and be like, hey, I spoke to a customer, I heard what their experience was like, and will really resonate with them in the long term as well.
Cool, great. Okay. I think we've touched on this one briefly, but it would be nice to hear a little bit more because it's a fairly common occurrence. What happens when you have no budget to conduct research?
Okay, like I don't think I've ever been in an organization where I've been given like enough budget to do research. Like,
this is like Uber and Twitter we're talking about as well.
Yeah. Obviously don't tell them that, but yeah, honestly, like what is it? Marissa Mayer's got this great quote, like creativity loves constraints. And so I think figuring out really, really scrappy ways to do research can sort of show you that, wait, let me just back up. So to be clear, I do get budget at Twitter and at Uber. So it's not like I don't have any budget, but it's definitely not like enough for me to kind of go and get like every single software and methodology and do everything all the time.
We didn't want to throw Uber and Twitter under the bus there.
Well, yeah. So just to be clear, like they do have budget, but yeah, it's obviously not like huge amounts. You have to be very considerate about how you spend it. Dovetail, I just keep seeing like messages come up like, yeah, Dovetail gives me budget as well. Like no one doesn't not give me budget, but it's not like enough, right?
It's not a known department that receives bucket loads of funding traditionally.
Exactly.
Let's put it that way.
It's the best way to kind of describe it. Yeah, just to be clear. And so yeah, Marissa May has this great quote, like creativity loves constraints. And so I think finding really scrappy ways to do research can sort of show the value to your stakeholders really, really quickly. But then that will also then encourage that future investment for more work later down the track. So generally where I've seen budget being spent is either on participants or on software. So when it comes to participants, there's a variety of different ways that you can try to recruit. You can go through your own customer list, you can go through your own newsletter lists. If you're looking for other audiences, you can also look at social media platforms. So either posting across your own channels, but then also tapping into networks as well. So there might be communities or groups out there that are really interested in the topic that you're really interested in. And so you can actually start to harness them to be engaged in research as well. You can also do guerrilla testing or intercept testing, where you actually stand in a mall or like out on the street and you just grab people that you walk past. And so I will caveat that just make sure that you're in a place that allows for soliciting, just because you don't want to get in trouble for like soliciting people in an area that you're not supposed to be soliciting people in.
Yep.
On the flip side with software, like I think there's been a lot of new software that's come out over the last few years, like Dovetail, for example, that are really tailored more to how researchers do research. But if you don't have budget for those, the main Office suites, so Google Office, Microsoft Office, you can generally hack around those tools to get most of what you're looking for. It's not going to be perfect, but that's kind of the trade-off that you have with budget, is that the less budget you have, the less rigor you're going to be able to have around research. So being able to show the value that you can do with limited or no budget does, again, incentivize your stakeholders to be like, hey, if we want to do this better, we need more budget for X. I will say the one exception to budget, the one thing that you should always spend money on is paying your participants. They're giving their time up to talk to you, that's going to give value to you and your organization. So really making sure that you're paying them fairly is absolutely key. It might be that a gift card, it might be a discount to your product, it might be a gift basket. It doesn't always necessarily need to be cash, but you do need to be paying your participants.
Okay. One thing you mentioned actually, which I was just wondering, just an off the cuff question is, which I'm sure you love, if you were to leverage like an existing fan base of a product or something, like you were saying, through social media, is there a danger of getting biased interviewees because they already love the thing?
Well, it depends what you're looking for, right? So if you're looking for people that are engaged with a product, you might find that they're really passionate, but they'll definitely probably have an opinion about something. But if you're looking for a certain fan base of like one product, it might even be worth looking at fan bases of competing products. and reaching out to those groups as well and seeing what that difference is.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've found sort of, I've anyway got like a book side hustle, and like people, like when you see reviews and so on, like the same people will either hate or love the same exact thing about a book. So if you were to go to a competitor and go to the person that loves the product, they'd be like, that thing, I hate or love it. And it's like, what do you do with that kind of interview response? Like, is that,
Yeah,
that
like,
wasn't meant to be a question, but it turned into one.
yeah, like I feel like there's definitely, like, you're always going to find conflicting insights. Like if you're not, there's probably actually a bigger red flag out there. Like even all the research that I've conducted recently, like I've been getting like very conflicting responses around certain topics. Like take the spreadsheet and post it, for example. Like there's not one way that people are doing their analysis. And so when it comes to considering how we apply that to the product, we have to take in both of those perspectives. It's not just like one direction that we can go through. And so I think, you know, again, it comes back to that trade-off. So if you want to make sure that you're getting the diversity of those participants, you need to be able to spend the budget to either, you know, pay for a vendor to recruit for you or find other audiences or use like online tools to get those audiences. Otherwise, you know, you need to be, again, self-aware that, hey, I'm not talking to every single person that I want to talk to, but I'm going to set the expectations in my findings that this is kind of what it's related to.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left for questions and one sort of official question left, but I was just going to ask one very quick one, again, off the cuff. What is your take on using services that go out and find participants for you? Do you use them extensively, or has that, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I've definitely used them in the past. That's kind of where I've got budget from. But like, it really does depend on the audience that you're looking for. So when I was at Twitter, I was looking for a very specific type of user that had a very certain set of behaviors. And every other channel that I had just did not let me find this audience. And so we ended up using a third-party vendor to do the recruitment for us. It meant that we were paying like not a huge amount, but it wasn't like a minimal amount of money to get each of these participants. And so that gave us the right insights that we needed to capture to make the decisions around the product. And so I think it's a great investment if you really, really need it. But if you're looking for just like any customer or something that's incredibly broad, like I think there's many other ways that you can get participants for cheap or for free.
Right. So kind of there, if you need to go niche, then maybe consider that avenue, but otherwise you can probably do it.
Yeah, like the other thing you can also consider is like using ads as well. So like Facebook ads, for example, you can get incredibly granular with who you target. And so if you're looking for some, and Twitter ads as well, I think LinkedIn does. Yeah, all the different social platforms, like they have that level of granularity. And so it might even be worth like looking to see if that granularity is actually going to let you target the people that you're looking for and actually get them to click through and pay for an ad that way.
Yeah. I mean, Facebook ads I use, and they are, some would say, creepily granular. Like the amount of detail you can get in terms of who you're showing ads to is incredible. Anyway, moving on from that. So last sort of official question. So when, as a company or as a team, whatever the scenario, when is the right time to bring on a full-time researcher to like hire in that role versus having somebody already within the team, like a product manager or UXer, et cetera, do that work?
Yeah, I have many very strong feelings about this. So I feel like if you are planning on doing research, you should have a researcher, end of discussion. But I think if you're not able to afford a full-time researcher, just having someone come in and do like a foundational piece of research or doing like individual projects for you, I think is a really good sort of alternate option in that way, because the researcher is going to have that special set of skills that's really going to make sure that they can find the right insights that you're looking for without the biases and domain knowledge that you may have if you're within like a product or a design role. However, I know that is not always feasible. And so if you are a designer or a product manager that's really interested in doing research, make sure that you train up on like how to ask questions, how to consider your own biases, how to make sure that you're running the right methodologies, like all of more of those harder skills to make sure that when you're actually doing the research, you are as effective as possible to make sure that you are capturing those insights as well as you can. The other thing as well is just to, again, consider your own biases. So, you know, as a product manager, just make sure that you step away from the prioritization and the domain knowledge you have. If you're a designer, just step away from the design decisions that you've made, just to make sure that you really are trying to be as independent as possible when doing this.
Yeah, sounds good. And as a blatant shout out to Academy XI, if anyone who's in those roles would like to learn how to remove biases and ask the right questions, we do offer training on that. So that's about as far as I ever go down the, the product placement path in these webinars, which awkwardly brings us to the end of the questions that I have for you. And now we will flip over to the Q&A from our lovely audience. So we've got about 15 minutes for this, so got a good chunk of questions. We'll get through as many as we can. And oh, I see people are like thumbs upping that. I don't think people have been doing that before on previous webinars. So maybe, anyway, we'll try and get through all of them if we can. So usually I have a chance to read through these before, but we've been chatting, so I'll just read through them now. So from Abby Tidwell, what recommendations do you have for conducting research studies with a subject matter that is beyond your personal knowledge and experience? Oh, great question.
Yeah. This is a really great question. So what I would try to do, like when I was in consulting, I would come into this situation like every single time I started a new project. So I'd be thrown into a new client that I had no idea about, and I would have to pretend that I knew exactly what I was talking about very, very quickly. So what I would try to do is talk to stakeholders where you can, and people are more than happy to help you like skill up in these sorts of areas I found. So just asking all of the dumb questions to them really helps them, you know, educate each other on what that experience is like. The other thing is also looking at secondary research. So if there are like industry reports, news articles, blog posts that you can look at to start really getting those skill sets, coming in with at least a baseline understanding is really, really key. The other thing you can also just do is be very open and honest with people that you're talking to that you don't have a depth of experience, and let them know, hey, you know, I'm still learning about this area. That's why I'm doing the research, you know, and then you can ask for more of those clarifying questions as well afterwards.
Yeah, I guess is the nice thing about being like interviewing someone and just asking them questions is that the point of questions is to find out more. So
yeah, absolutely.
It's quite an interesting parallel to like our space with our learning designers who design our courses, because they're experts in how to learn. So they create like sort of the schedule and like, okay, activities need to go here, you know, like theory goes here, etc. But they don't necessarily know the subject matter that they are designing the course around. They work with a subject matter expert on that. So it becomes this kind of symbiosis, which is kind of interesting. Do you work sometimes, like when you're interviewing, would you have a subject matter expert there ever, or is that a thing?
Not necessarily with me in the interviews, but I think on the flip side as well, like, so I'm a researcher, and at my role at Dovetail, I'm researching researchers about research, which is the most meta thing I've ever done in my entire life.
That is meta, yeah.
But like, I will go into these conversations and pretend that I don't know anything. So like, I will have a pretty good idea of like what the approach is going to be. I have a pretty good idea of what they're going to say, but I will act so dumb in these meetings because I want to not have any assumptions. So I want to learn and I want to relearn every single time I have these conversations, because there may be something that I'm assuming that may not necessarily be correct. So even if I do have that domain knowledge, I will actually go in sort of similar to not having that domain knowledge to make sure that I learn as much as humanly possible as well.
Great. Okay, that's a great question, Abby. Thank you. From Chris Wood, just some good, I'm assuming probably online resources is the easiest, good resources to help people become better UX researchers. Are there any tools out there? I guess you mentioned Google and Microsoft Suite, but anything else?
Yeah, there's like a bunch of Slack communities that I've joined recently, which I actually think have been really, really great to just learn more about UX research and like techniques, and actually have conversations with other stakeholders, sorry, other like people that are doing research as well. So UXR Collective is a really great one. Rosenfeld Media is a really great one. Research Ops is a really great one. But those communities are great because if you have questions, if you're not really sure on a methodology or like how to do something, then you can actually have that conversation with stakeholders, which I think is great as well.
Cool, good. All right, let's see what we got here. From Harveen, so if stakeholders come to you with a requirement, we need to build XYZ app, but the research doesn't back that up, how do you, like he said, how do you validate the point that it's not backing it up? Do you cite demographics? Like how do you sort of try to convince them that it's maybe not the right idea? Good question, actually.
Yeah, so I would try to understand why in the first place that they want to build the app. So there's this other technique you can do as a researcher called the 5 whys, and you literally just ask why like 5 times and be like, why this, why this, why this, why this? Because what you kind of want to get to at the end is like fundamentally what is causing this, and it might be that a stakeholder has decided that they need to build this, or like there's a customer that's really advocating for this. And so I think really understanding what's causing this in the first place, I think is incredibly key. And that'll also give whoever's sort of pushing for the app, whatever feature that they want to launch, sort of more that they need to provide the justification, because there may also be data or research out there that you may not necessarily have access to, that's making them have that decision. And so just having that shared understanding can be really key. But I think the other part of this as well is, again, becoming that trusted advisor with your different stakeholders to make sure that, you know, when these things are coming up, you're sort of working together to figure out what the knowledge gaps are to find what the best solution is for them.
Yeah, good call to the 5 whys. We teach that extensively. I always equate it to like when you've got like a toddler who's like, why? Seems a bit silly, but is incredibly useful when someone, even maybe themselves, didn't actually know why they felt that something was the right direction to go. And yeah, maybe they might be right. They might have data that you're just not aware of. But they don't think that way. They're not like, oh, this person doesn't have this data. And so maybe that's them like, oh, what? Oh, I should give you this at the end of the 5 whys potentially. From John and Englis, sorry, I probably butchered that. In terms of incentives for participants, I'm assuming, are there any rules of thumb, expectation level for timings? I guess he's asked about usability testing specific. Is it a 30 minutes? Is there a length around that? Like, is there sort of a formula?
Yes, and I guess there is and there isn't. I think it really depends on the type of participants that you're reaching out to. So if it's a really easy participant recruit, then you're probably going to be able to incentivize a lot less. I don't want to give specific numbers because I don't want to like influence on that. But generally, if it's easier to recruit for, you can probably pay less. If it's harder to recruit for, so generally like B2B, for example, is much harder to recruit for, you may pay a little bit more for that. The timing is also a consideration. So generally, you know, you're probably paying like a little bit less for 30 minutes than you would be for an hour. But it might also depend on the topic. So if it's a really easy topic, again, you probably want to weight more towards like a cheaper incentive versus if it's going to be really difficult, like hard conversation, you might want to weight more. What you might generally find is you can put out like an incentive out there, and if you're not really getting the participants that you want, you can sort of change that number as well as you go through your research.
Do you find is technical knowledge from the participant usually more expensive?
Yeah, anything that requires them to like think more, generally you kind of want to push it up a little bit.
Or have more existing knowledge, I guess, themselves.
Yeah.
Great. So Jamie asking a question for Suma. When you decide that you're done with research, when do you decide that you're done with research and move forward into the insight phase? How do you know?
Yeah, generally it's when you start to hear patterns coming up very frequently. So if you're hearing the same thing over and over again in the conversations that you're having, it's probably a constructive time to probably just pause and make sure that you have all the information that you need to move to that next phase. In saying that though, just because you finish that research doesn't mean that's when you have to stop completely. So if you do your analysis and your insights and you realize, hey, there's actually like a little bit more I want to dive into about topic X, you can always loop back and do a couple more interviews if you need to. But again, just setting expectations with your stakeholders on who you did and didn't interview and timelines and things like that.
Okay. And from Ty, what would you say to engineers who are expecting to start a build, but the user research is still underway? So they've got a timeline, I guess, that is met, and then the researcher is still working away.
Yeah, that's a really tough situation to be in. What I would try to do is if there's ways to move around what you're actually building, so the things that aren't going to be influenced by the research outcomes are built before the research is done. So like foundational work has been kind of effective for me. So there's definitely been times where engineers are like, we have to start, but I'm still doing the analysis or I'm still trying to get to those insights. And so I would actually work with the engineering manager or the product manager to see if there's ways to actually make sure that we still have that breathing room. But what I would try to do then next time is make sure that when you are doing the timelines, you are giving sort of some contingency time to research to make sure that you are getting those findings before you start doing the engineering.
So is that just a little bit of massaging of the sprints and some creative Jira use potentially?
Yeah. The other thing as well, one of the outputs I actually did for a project that kind of was in a similar situation was I ended up writing my research outputs as user stories in Jira. So rather than actually doing a research report, I actually wrote the user story so they could just quickly get in and prioritize rather than sort of having to go through that process of writing out the report, then the PM translating that to then actually getting them into Jira. So that just helped with that efficiency to make sure that the timeline wasn't going to get pushed far too back.
Right. And for anyone out there who's not sort of familiar, Jira is I guess, project management software for building software. And it's all about running agile teams. From Ling Ying, question, when presenting the insights findings to the stakeholders, what evidence do you usually add to the deck? So like what format? I guess I touched on this earlier, actually.
I love this question. I love this question so much. So there's two ways of presenting information. There is deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So deductive is kind of like A to B to C equals D. And generally you find this in more academic backgrounds because that's kind of how you write a research report. However, in business, you actually want to be in more of an inductive model, which is A because of B, C, and D, which means it's sort of what the answer is up front and then the reasoning afterwards. And so the way that you kind of build out a research report is that up front, you should have what your point of view is and the executive summary. So the first thing that your stakeholders see is what the answer is. So they don't have to wait for like a 30 or a 1 hour presentation to get to those insights. After that, then you can start justifying why you've made that decision. But you only really need to go to the ones that they don't necessarily agree with, right? But what I would try to do is when you're building out like a presentation is just make sure that it's in an easily digestible format. So you don't want to have rows and rows of text. So maybe like 3 or 4 key bullets, maybe a quote, maybe a video, but something that's going to really clearly visualize those findings. So the stakeholders can really understand that message that you're trying to share.
Yeah, and we've actually, in the training space, see that a lot where we're trying to sort of, it's slightly different, but trying to conduct training or pass on information using a format that the audience isn't used to. So like we used to, like we do sometimes use like things like Miro board or Mural, which are collaboration tools to pass on information. But if the participants have never used that before, it's kind of just, it's a loss. Whereas, okay, they use PowerPoint, we're going to deliver the insights in PowerPoint just because you don't want an extra layer of like technology or something like that sitting between them and understanding what you're trying to tell them, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to consider as well is it might even be worth having a conversation with your stakeholder when you first like meet with them or like as a catch up, like ask them, how do you actually want to get your findings? Some of them might actually want to have a conversation and discuss it with you. Some of them may just want to have an email or a Slack message that has those points. But understanding how they want to receive the information will make sure that you can actually then reframe it into a really effective way that's going to resonate with them as well.
Yeah, and something we often will talk about is when people think about customer centricity or being human centered, they just think about customers, but I'm like, you can act that way with your internal staff. And so if someone's asking you for research, they may then be just turning around and then presenting that to somebody else. And that person may have specific ways that they want to receive the information. So by asking that question to your boss, you may be saving their ass further up the line, things like that. So it's good to be thinking about how people ingest information. We've just got a very short period of time left. I'll probably just pick one last question to answer here. And then we've got a few last free gifts, actually, excitingly, and information on an upcoming webinar. So last question from Kieran. To what extent are product managers involved in user research? I guess we have touched on this, but say that you are, let's say for the purposes of this, that you're the user researcher, they're the product manager, you're kind of working in a team. How do you two interact?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like with product managers, they're people that really need to be able to take the customer insight as well as the business insight to make those decisions around what product priorities are and sort of make sure that whatever's being built is really supporting what those customer pain points are. And so at the end of the day, product managers are still going to be talking to customers. It's not like they're generally not, but it's really about making sure that you can kind of be that trusted advisor to them. So the conversations that they're having with their own customers and stakeholders, you can kind of augment that with all the other information that you have as a user researcher, so you can both come to the decision on what those product priorities should be. So I really see it as a partnership between product and research, and it's probably the most important relationship that you'll generally have in a product organization. The way you also might want to engage product managers is having them involved during the journey of research, sort of what I mentioned earlier. So having them contribute questions to knowledge gaps that they may have, having them participate in research. If you also want to train them up, it's a really great opportunity to have them maybe run 1 or 2 interviews and you can sort of coach them as a researcher afterwards. But then making sure that when those final findings are coming out, that they're really aligned, because if you have buy-in with a product manager, they're more likely to weave it into the prioritization that they're doing longer term as well.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think that brings us to the end of our questions. We have 1 minute left. So I think you had a gift to share.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you everybody for joining today. I hope you learned something new. But to help you on your research journey, Dovetail is really excited to offer everybody a special 60-day free trial. Generally, our trials last for 7 days, but I think this is a really great opportunity to start doing synthesis, start sort of learning about qualitative research. And so the details about this will be available in the email after the webinar.
Great. And I'd like to thank Jess for coming on. Really, really interesting to get your insights on this space, insights on insights, I guess. A last thing from me, I guess, yeah, we'll have a follow-up email sending out tomorrow where we'll kind of, we'll try to answer some of the questions that we missed in the Q&A. And thank you guys for firing all those at us. That was great. Really good questions in there too. We, Academy XI, have a webinar coming up in 2 weeks on unpacking UX. So it's sort of going from research into user experience design. So I'm talking with a subject matter expert around things like wireframing, user flows, et cetera, but sort of just from a quite a foundational perspective. So no need to have an existing skill set in that space, but everyone is welcome. We'll also just have a little bit more information on our training programs in the email that comes out tomorrow. And we have a monthly newsletter around the human-centered design space that will be launching very shortly. And you can also find out about future webinars in that as well. So again, thank you very much to Jess. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for this session. We really appreciate it. Thanks for all the thanks coming in there. And we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.